Okay, so this week we are broadening out to world systems and talking about what those are in addition to the relation with imperialism and colonialism. So this week we're really going ever more macro, really pushing the boundaries of what sociologists and other social scientists look at. Um, Generally, if we're looking at in terms of scale, there are three levels of analysis that we've largely looked at before. Um, this is often called levels of analysis in the social science world. The three levels being individual, interactional, and structural. So individual theories are looking at how does society or the social world affect the self, or how are we socialized into roles or norms. The interactional is the theories of interpersonal communication, interaction, the ways in which we develop relationships with other people, etc. And then structural theories of institutionalized interactions, systems, rules, organizations. Sometimes people will put organizations in between interactions and structures. For the purposes of this, we're just going to lump them all under one. Um, however, when we talk about structural, they often are included within a certain society. So we talk about things like the legal system. When we talk about a legal system, that is generally rooted in one society or one nation. There are international laws, but these are largely unenforced and often dominated by certain countries. And so it's not a lot, people often dismiss that as the right way to think about it, and instead move towards thinking about even broader than structures, the world systems. And this comes from Wallerstein, who is the one you read this week. And before we get into Wallerstein, I wanted to show how these levels of analysis have match up with various people that we've studied before. So levels of analysis, when we've looked at any kind of socialization of identity, intersectionality, embodiment, those are all individual theories on how the social world affects the individual or within the individual. So Cooper's talked about this a little bit. Crenshaw, who we didn't read, but she was in last week's presentation. Collins talks about embodiment quite a bit, as well as Bourdieu, but I would argue both of them are broader. They talk about a lot more than just one. Um, Interactional theories include symbolic interactionism, Weber's social action types. A lot of Weber or Durkheim's theories are interactional, and how the social system is produced through interactions between people. But Durkheim also moves quite heavily into the structural as well, as does Weber. So even though I'm trying to pigeonhole these theorists into one level, they often are speaking a broad um, swath. So instructional, we have the modes of production, biopower from Foucault, the matrix of domination from Collins, theories of modernity, which we didn't get into this semester. But those are all kind of larger structural ideas of how societies are structured. Um, but as I said, most of these theorists kind of talk about ways societies work at all levels. So with Du Bois, we've looked at racial consciousness, which is a very individual idea. Racial projects, the veil would be interactional as well, racial antagonism. And then under structural, he really pushes modes of production, capitalism, that would all fit there. So Du Bois is definitely looking at a wide range of levels of analysis. Collins as well, when you delineate the levels of power she describes, from interpersonal to group and community to hegemonic and structural. And Bourdieu also does this. So the habitus is something that has the social world has influenced itself into the habitus. But as we play out the habitus and interact with other people's habitus, it starts to structure the field. So these are he bridges these all together, but they all miss this like broader structure or broader megastructure. Now, when we look at nations, we didn't read a lot of these, but if you're interested in national level theories, some of the most important readers, I would argue, are these four. Nancy Fraser, I'm adding some of her work as optional next week. James Scott is a really important anthropologist who looks at the creation of nations. Theda Skocpol looks at international relationships and how those intersect each other. And Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who also looks at how nations internationally and domestically structure poverty and the economy. However, there are still even broader than nations, the megastructures. These are the world systems, colonialism, capitalism, imperialism. We are going to look at Wallerstein specifically, but I've also included Connell and Brown as other important theorists to consider. We will read Brown next week. Raywyn Connell talks about masculinity as a global system, that there are parts of the theory of gender that affects all of us, and incorporates elements of world systems in that analysis. So if you're interested in gender or sexuality, Raywyn Connell's piece is a great one to hone into. And we will get to Brown's analysis next week on neoliberalism. But let's talk about what is world systems. And first, Immanuel Wallerstein. He is an American sociologist. His family were Jewish refugees from Poland. He really pioneered economic sociology and revitalized political sociology. He really showed that sociologists can analyze economics just as well as economists can. He became the president of the International Sociological Association and has been a widely influential activist as well as sociologist and academic. So what is a world system? He's trying to delineate between a identifiable system that exists within the world and then a system that is a world in and of itself. So when we say system of the world, that's when we talk about a nation or a community or a town or even a family. Those kind of systems, you can locate and define its elements, and you can see things that are both outside of those elements and inside of those elements. For world systems, he's talking about something that really connects almost every social structure throughout the world, and that is hard to distinguish any element that is outside of that structure, right? So when we think about my family, what happens in my family probably isn't affecting the economics of China. However, the economics of China probably do affect my family in some way. So that my family is a system of the world, but economics, like world economics, is a system that is a world. Wallerstein argues that there are only two varieties of world systems that we've seen. One is world economies, like capitalism, in which almost every nation in the world engages in capitalism in some way, or world empires. He gives examples of the Roman Empire, Han China, and even though the Roman Empire didn't take up the entirety of the world, a lot of the economics, the politics, the culture was contained within that empire. And didn't have as much connection to the outside world, largely because of restrictions on travel and communication. So a world system includes large bureaucratic structures, an international division of labor, and multiple cultures, and potentially, as we see, multiple political systems within capitalism itself. Here are some quotes from Wallerstein. So a world system is made up of conflicting forces which hold it together by tension and tear it apart as each group seeks to eternally remold it to its advantage. So this is part of what he's saying as world systems are unstable because as there's always people vying for a position of power within that world system. And he says that it's actually pretty peculiar that the world economy or capitalism has survived for 500 years and not transformed into a world empire, which is a political system, and that the world economy exists without the political infrastructure. Now, some people, including Wallerstein towards the end of his life, argued that part of this is because the world economy has been able to influence politics to its own benefit rather than set up a politics by itself. Are there any questions on how to define a world system or what that means or how is it different than other systems? Okay. In the next slide, we're going to talk about what are the elements of the current world system, the world economy. So, Wallerstein distinguishes between three types of countries and how the world system, the capitalism world system, is set up. So there are core countries, peripheral countries, and semi-peripheral countries. The core countries are often what we think about in terms of industrialized nations. These are nations that are the advantage areas of the world economy, the ones that have highest rates of consumption, highest rates of health, of wellness, and also are able to dominate and exploit peripheral countries for labor and material. The peripheral countries are those that are disadvantaged or marginalized areas of the world economy and require capital or money from the core countries. They require investments, they require aid, they required some kind of assistance in order to develop or even just survive. Semi-peripheral countries are the intermediators. These are the ones that help move goods from periphery to core or move labor between the two or move capital. So they kind of serve as intermediaries. Now, when we look at which countries are which, there are often a debate as to where the countries lie, but largely this map helps us see which countries are defined as core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So we see that the core countries are largely identified as Western nations, in addition to Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So these are the wealthy nations, the ones that have the most capital, the most industry, the most factories, etc. The peripheral nations are largely Africa, Middle Asia, Southeast Asia, and you see a lot of Central America as well. And then the semi-periphery, or those intermediary countries, are Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Russia, a lot of Eastern Europe, China, India. And economists are arguing that there is going to be, within the next 30 years, a change from for Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and Russia as moving into the core countries. However, this would create a tension because China and Russia specifically still hold on to a more communistic or state-run economy, and that would be an interesting challenge for the world economy as a whole, which is based in capitalism. So, areas are in constant tension to either keep their status or move into the core group or avoid moving into the lower groups. So there's always a incentive to exploit or to make any kind of gain. We also see that capitalism has pushed itself into almost every country, regardless of whether that country wanted it. So China has actually made moves to allow for more privatization of the economy. Russia as well. We saw the fall of the USSR. Even Cuba has been changing somewhat. So capitalism has encroached upon almost every part of the world. And one of the reasons this is so hard to dismantle or disrupt, we see in this quote on the left, the absence of a central political mechanism for the world economy makes it very difficult to intrude counteracting forces to the maldistribution of rewards. So in the US, if there is a dispute about wages or labor, we can appeal to the government. We can ask for the state or the legal system to bring a class action lawsuit, or we can enforce union demands. However, if you've got a US company or a British company that is working in, let's say Zimbabwe or Senegal, and it is exploiting the workers, how do those workers in a nation that is dependent upon the capital brought in by that company make any claims for support or for redress? It's very hard when capitalism as a whole it has no central, planning board that says, here's where we're going to exploit and here's where we're going to privilege. So it's very hard to make any political gains in that regard in a world economy. Are there any questions on how Wallerstein imagines the world economy as a world system? Okay, so one of the examples I have here is COVID-19. So we've seen very much over the past 2 years that rich countries have been hoarding COVID-19 vaccines. I don't have updated statistics, but I would not be surprised if it has not changed that much. So more than 80 million COVID vaccine doses have, by January 29, 2021, 80 million have been distributed around the world, but only 55, that's not 55 million, that's just 55 at that time, had gone to Guinea. I am guessing that there have been changes to this, but it's definitely not enough. In the Brookings Institute showed that the developing world has the highest percentage of the global population. 84% of the world's population lives in the developing world. Global priority groups include those that are physicians, the elderly, people with other disabilities or medical issues. And the 71% of global priority groups live in the developing world. And yet only 49% of vaccines have been sent to that developing world. So the developing world includes all countries outside of the poor countries. That's what it means by the developing world. So this is an example of how the world economy is hoarding medical supplies, resources, capital, rather than an equitable distribution to ensure that everyone is vaccinated against COVID. Any questions? Okay, so we are going to look at next colonialism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism, and see how some of these operate as world systems or do not operate as world systems, but in other words, do include or are categorized as mega structures, right? Something that is larger than a simple structure or a nation. So colonialism is control by one people or power over another people's area, occupying it with settlers, military, and exploiting it economically. So it's defined by political control by one person or people over another. And usually it includes settlers, military, and economic exploitation. Here we have a map of the British Empire in the mid 18th century, of everywhere that they held political and economic and military control, everywhere from the British Antarctic Territory, which I did not know that they had quote unquote colonized there, as well as large portions of Africa, India, Burma, Australia, New Zealand, as we know, Canada, and the US. And so this is, if you can remember back to your high school social science days, when with the slogan that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because literally at all times in all over the world, the British Empire was working and was taking money and taking it back to the home country. One of the videos you show is how often small countries need to engage in colonialism of some sort because they don't have many resources within their countries. So Britain and Japan are both are not resource-rich countries, right? They do not have many. They do not have oil. They do not have a large swath of land for grain, for food. And so part of what they needed to do is colonize, is go into other countries and extract resources back to the home country. Now, we often give colonialism a bad rap, and I'm going to show you both sides of that debate. First, Thomas Sowell has argued that colonization actually created a net positive for the organization or for the countries and regions it colonized. So he gives four examples, and specifically he's talking here about Roman imperialism in Britain, but also European colonialism to Africa, to Asia, to South America. That one, it reduces internal fighting, so tribal fights, conflicts. Two, it provides a unified system of law as a framework for stability, security. Three, that it gives an advanced system of technology and organization. And four, it provides like contact with the wider world, like transportation, technology, communication, that enables creative potential to emerge. I'm curious if either of you have thoughts on Thomas Sowell's argument here. You don't have to have a thought. If you... I hear
I
Johnson
don't know if I
laughing.
have a thought yet.
Okay.
I was just trying to absorb it. So let me absorb it.
Sure. I will say that it is interesting that number one is saying it's a reduction or cessation of internal fighting. But if you look, it's hard to, I wish I could give I mean, I wish I could take a history lesson on this, but as well as give it. After World War II, when the nations decided to, essentially the Western nations decided we need to stop colonizing and we need to stop our imperialism. And so they divided, oh, this was even before actually, but regardless, when they stopped colonizing Africa, they left a lot of the countries, they set the boundaries of the countries. They said, you are Angola, you are, Ethiopia, you are Kenya, you are Congo, despite grouping in a bunch of, warring factions and tribes as they were. They put them into one country and said, govern yourselves. And we see today that this has not stopped or reduced the infighting between tribes. In Ethiopia today, the nation of Ethiopia, I think, is made up of about 6 major tribes, And when the Ethiopians won independence, the tribes got together, and part of their constitution was that if any tribe wanted to leave Ethiopia and start its own state, it could. Um, and recently, one of the tribes, which has been attacked by the other tribes for centuries, has declared its interest in leaving, and there is currently a genocide against that tribe in Ethiopia, trying to wipe it out and make sure that that the other tribes retain control over the land and area. So it's not as if colonization um, reduced any of this, but in fact might have hidden it or disguised it or paused it for a while. But conflicts are still going. To give you an alternative explanation or perspective, we're going to go with Aimé Césaire. He is a politician from, oh boy, I can't believe I didn't put it there. I'm pretty sure it's Jamaica. He's a politician in the Caribbean. Also, he's a poet and spent a lot of his life exposing what he calls the horrors of colonialism. And I'm going to read to you from some of his work. And here are some notes about it. But he says, let us speak about the colonized. I see clearly what colonization has destroyed. The wonderful Indian civilization, neither deterring nor Royal Dutch nor Standard Oil will ever console me for the Aztecs and the Incas. I see clearly the civilizations condemned to perish at a future date, into which it has produced a principle of ruin. The South Sea Islands, Nigeria, Nyasaland. I see less clearly the contributions it has made. Security, culture, the rule of law. In the meantime, I look around, and wherever there are colonizers and the colonized face to face, I see brutality, I see force, cruelty, sadism, conflict, and in a parody of education, the hasty manufacture of a few thousand subordinate functionaries, boys, artisans, office clerks, and interpreters necessary for the smooth operation of business. I spoke of contact. But between colonizer and colonized, there is room only for forced labor, intimidation, pressure, the police, taxation, theft, rape, compulsory crops, contempt, mistrust, arrogance, self-complacency, swinishness, brainless elites, and degraded masses. He says, they talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, and improved standards of living, but I'm talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, and extraordinary possibilities wiped out. He continues, no human contact, but relations of domination and submission, which turned the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man simply into an instrument of production. It's my turn to state an equation. Colonization equals thingification, meaning it turns people into objects and things. For my part, I make a systematic defense of the non-European civilizations. This is still Césaire. Every day that passes, every denial of justice, every beating by the police, every demand of the workers that is drowned in blood, every scandal that is hushed up, every punitive expedition, every policeman, every militiaman brings home to us the value of our old societies. They were communal societies, never societies of the many for the few. They were societies that were not only anti-capitalists, but also anti-capitalists. They were democratic societies, always. They were cooperative societies, fraternal societies. I make a systematic defense of the societies destroyed by imperialism. They were, in fact, they did not pretend to be the ideal. Despite their faults, they were neither to be hated nor condemned. They were content simply to be. In them, neither the word failure nor the word avatar had any meaning. They kept hope intact. So, based on Sowell and Césaire, how do we reconcile these two perspectives about colonialism?
I'm still thinking about it. I
That's
Can
a
you?
think
Oh,
I,
sorry, Johnsy.
that's okay. I'm still thinking about it, but I think I agree with, is it Ame?
yeah.
Um,
I'm
I
not sure
think
how to
I,
pronounce it.
yeah, I'm gonna look it up, but I think I agree with him, in lots of ways. And I'd have to go back again now because I didn't get, can you go back to the other one?
Sowell?
Uh, yeah, there was, the number two item where he says a unified system of law is a framework.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then you go to May, and he says something about the promise of colonization was the rule of law.
Mm-hmm.
And I did find it interesting that they both uh, seem to understand that the rule of law is an important stabilizer for a society,
I would say, uh,
even though they don't think it happened. I'm
okay, yes.
saying,
Yes.
yeah,
I was
they
gonna
don't.
say,
Right. No,
Césaire
I
is
see
not
that
saying it
they don't
actually
believe it
happened.
happened.
Yes.
Right. They're not saying it actually happened, but I think they both see why, if in its ideal, its importance.
Right. And
Yeah.
I would say that one of Césaire's thing is that he would say that there was a law. There was a rule of law in these societies. It simply wasn't the colonizers' rule of law, right? It was
Okay.
a different way of living. Brittany, what were you going to say?
I was still thinking through it too. What I think is huge for me, in this, the colonizers promise and the colonizers provide, is
Hmm.
the disadvantage of the loss of culture
Yeah.
that they experience, and how it was like crazy, how like they promised them all this stuff and just like destroyed
Mm,
everything that they built,
right.
um I actually had, in one of my other classes, we talked a lot about this and imperialism and all this stuff, and it's just like, I don't, it's heartbreaking, to see and to hear and like even write about what they experienced,
Hmm.
they were like betrayed.
Very much so. Um, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what I highly recommend the piece by Ame Cesar, and I'm trying to I'll put it in the actual lecture. I'll link it because it is very powerful. Um, and I think a really fascinating thing to do is to learn about an indigenous culture and wonder what would have happened if that culture or society had, the 300, the 400 years to develop on their own, right? Probably with trade. Trade is a necessary part of life, but without colonization. I did this with a friend of mine who is Hopi, and we talked about how um, medicine would be completely different if indigenous tribes were able to develop on their own. They had a more in tune um, connection to nature. So, would we have more holistic medicine? Would we have more natural medicine rather than, pharmaceutical or a drug-based medical system? But even thinking about social arrangements, indigenous tribes in the US had much more expansive views of gender and sexuality. So, would we be forced into a rigid gender system? They had much more tolerant views of religion and expansive views of religion, ways of working the fields, right? And so I think it's a really important exercise to imagine how would society be without colonization and what advancements, both in terms of science, culture, religion, would we experience without um, the complete domination of one society over another. Does anyone have any thoughts or want to add?
I think I would add to that for sure, professor. I've talked to you about it in some ways
Hmm.
as it relates to African Americans, and particularly the loss of language uh, during slavery and all of that. There's so much language and culture that was lost, and I often wonder about it
Yeah.
and what it would be, what the country might look like if everyone was allowed to keep their culture and all of that. I appreciated what you said about that, Brittany. That stood out to me too.
Yeah. It is a sobering discussion, but it's an important one to have, especially as we look to what's next. And I think it's important to be honest about the history, right? And that's why I think Wallerstein's idea of the world system helps us understand um, how these like colonial systems might be perpetuating. And that's where we get into imperialism and neocolonialism. So let's, unlike, so colonialism is a form of imperialism. So imperialism is extending a country or people's power and influence through diplomacy, economics, or military force. So it's not, colonialism is one way to establish an imperial rule, right? Going in and taking over the government and settling the area. But you could also do it through threats, through economic embargoes, through, um, not necessarily taking over the country, but bringing in your military and saying, do it or else, right? So imperialism is a broader idea that encompasses colonialism. Now, we're not going to watch this, but I highly recommend you do. This is the banana wars between the late 1800s and the 1940s or so. In brief, if you are not familiar with it, the United Fruit Company had owned a lot of banana plantations throughout Central America. And uh, over time, like it went in and it bought out a lot of the land from these countries. And so a lot of the fertile land was owned by a couple of banana companies, but the largest one was United Fruit. Um, and what happened, like over time, a lot of these countries elected more progressive leaders that tried to take the land back and give it to the indigenous people to be able to, here's land, go make your lives worthwhile. And the companies were able to get the US government and the CIA involved to go overthrow these democratically elected leaders and put in regimes that would protect the interests of these companies. Um, and so that is an example of imperialism without colonialism, right? We didn't go in and take over Guatemala or Honduras or Venezuela, but we did go in and through economic force, through military like subversion, we uh, enacted American will on the countries. Neocolonialism, again, is another form of imperialism. Um, it's the use of economic, political, cultural, or other pressures to control countries, especially former dependencies, and is used through soft power, meaning pressure or treaties, trade agreements, etc. So neocolonialism is a new idea that is arguing colonialism still exists. It's simply done by economic means rather than political means. So this is where instead of looking at world empires, it seems we have switched to world economies, right? So it's less about a political takeover and more about an economic takeover. We see this, a lot of sociologists, economists, etc., critique large monetary institutions like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, as doing this. They really replicate what is going on going back, I guess I could have done this a better way. They really replicate this model. So what the World Bank will do, for example, is it will take capital from the core countries, bring them into the periphery countries, and say, here is some money, make a profit. Make a profit off of this money, and now you are in debt to the World Bank. The peripheral country will then use its cheap labor and raw materials to produce goods to send to the core countries. So this might be things like oil, like copper, diamonds, etc. Then the peripheral countries have to pay back that money, right? So they pay back the money to the World Bank. They've given up their labor and raw materials that also go to the core companies. And then the core companies then send the consumption goods back to the periphery countries to buy. So they take the oil and metal and they make a car and they send it to the peripheral countries. They make clothes, they send it to the peripheral countries. And so it essentially is creating a loop that continues bringing capital into the core countries and making the peripheral countries lose raw materials and pay the core countries for the high profit goods like the cars, the stereos, the clothes, etc. So when we look at comics like this, it's showing that the peripheral countries of Africa are losing their raw materials, and that's leading to high amounts of capital in European and American countries. Another two examples of the change from colonialism to neocolonialism. On the left, you have a colonialist saying, I claim this land in the name of His Majesty, right? A political takeover coming in and saying this land is now owned by my government. And on the right is a play on a neocolonialist move by the IMF by saying, I structurally adjust this land in the name of economic growth, right? So it's coming in and demanding changes and dictating terms. It's simply under a different idea, which is the economic system rather than the national system. On the right, we have, again, a then and now, where in the then it was the West enslaving poor countries, people of color, and today it's doing that through debt rather than outright enslavement, right? So again, it's a move from military or outright oppression to economic exploitation. Any questions on that, on the move from colonialism to neocolonialism? Okay. If you are interested in examples of this, a really great example is the failure of the Green Revolution, in which American companies wanted to, quote unquote, help Africa and South America and Southeast Asia become agriculturally viable on its own. And the ways they did that was essentially impoverishing these countries and making them grow cash crops for Western countries rather than subsistence crops for themselves. If you're interested in that, email me and I'm happy to send you sources about that. So in summary, the world system is a form of neocolonialism as we see today. I wanted to end with Walter Rodney, giving an example of this. Walter Rodney was writing in the mid-1900s during the time of the late years of W.E.B. Du Bois, but also during the time of the Black Panthers and a burgeoning Pan-African movement. And he went and studied how like the title says, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And he wrote, as part of his first chapter, when citizens of Europe own the land and the mines of Africa, this is the most direct way of sucking the African content. Under colonialism, the ownership was complete and backed by military domination. Today, in many African countries, the foreign ownership is still present, although the armies and flags of foreign powers have been removed. So long as foreigners own land, mines, factories, banks, insurance companies, means of transportation, newspapers, power stations, etc., then for so long will the wealth of Africa flow outwards into the hands of those elements. In other words, in the absence of direct political control, foreign investment ensures that the natural resources and the labor of Africa produce economic value which is lost to the continent. So this is a perfect demonstration here that the natural resources and labor of Africa are producing economic value that are going to the core countries rather than staying within the peripheral countries. And that is it for this week. Any questions or comments?
That's quite interesting, Professor.
I'm glad you used that term rather than depressing or sombering. But I think it helps to see how like it's interesting to now think of, you know, the structural ideas that we've been reading about, like Foucault's ideas of disciplinary power, the matrix of domination, and how now it complicates that to think of how does that work in this system, right? What does that mean? Is it all reduced to economics now, or is what, you know, it's a hard question to ask and one that I think is important to grapple with. So I wanted to make sure that the last 2 weeks of the course we really grapple with these larger, like uber macro systems, social systems that really affect the ways we live and, you know, act, believe, think, do, love, etc. So, any other comments? I know this was a lot, so if you take time thinking about this and down the road you want to discuss, as always, my office is always open, so just let me know when you want to meet and discuss. Otherwise, have a great week, and I will upload the content for Thursday soon, where we talk about the theory of neoliberalism and how it changed the world. Okay?
Thank
All right,
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a great time. We'll talk to you soon.
You too.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.